Hey everyone, Positron here with a special follow-up to the Ignition Factor playthrough. So pretty recently I had done a playthrough of the Ignition Factor for the Super Nintendo, a game that was put out by Jaleco back in the day. And it's a pretty fun firefighting game, very unique for the Super Nintendo. But I think we all noticed along the way that there's some very strange translations, some very quirky things, some translations that just don't make sense, things that are out of place, and some pretty actually silly and funny references that are made throughout the game. And when I was done, I was looking through the credits and noticed this one name that stood out to me, Joe Fnord Sislow. And I was like, this has got to be the guy that worked on the translation, right? So I did a little bit of research and I actually tracked down Joe Sislow, got in touch with him, and he agreed to do a bit of an interview about the game, about his time at Jaleco, and some things related along the way. So you'll see there's about 45 minutes of audio here, and I'll have some game footage in the background, both of the Ignition Factor and a couple other projects he's worked on. And he's going to talk a lot about his time at Jaleco, what went into the Ignition Factor, how the translation came to be. It was really great to talk to him. It was really great that he was willing to and able to share some of the documentation that he had for the game. And I hope you enjoy. How did you get started at Jaleco? How did that come to be?
So my first game job was doing video game testing for Mindscape in high school. A good friend of mine called me up and was like, "Hey, I just got a job working for this company, Mindscape." So I've always grown up in the Chicago area, been around here, and Mindscape used to be in Northbrook. Great building, by the way. It was like Pee Wee's Playhouse. They had it set up. I don't know how they had so
Nice.
much money. But a friend of mine called me up and was like, "Hey, they're looking for testers." And I was like, "Testing video games? Sign me up." There wasn't a game that I didn't play. Of course, similar to meeting your heroes, when you actually start doing QA for video games for real, you realize exactly how bad it is when you have to play the same game that I'm divided on whether or not it's good to play a game that you like and destroy it, or you play something you don't care about enough that you see it in your sleep. I don't know which is worse, really. So anyways, I started QA there, and a couple of the guys who worked QA management there was a woman, Nancy Perla. Her husband, Jeff Hill, wound up being the product manager for Jaleco. So they knew us from QA over there, and a bunch of us from Mindscape wound up being QA at Jaleco. And as with most promotions through attrition, you wind up finding your way up through the ranks. I still remember one of the promotions I got was because they called me on a Saturday because they had gotten a new ROM of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, and I was the only one who could run through it. And they called me on a Saturday, and I had to redo the Nintendo tape. They dropped me down. I played through the entire game in one take in like 2.5 hours and walked out. And I actually got promoted for that because nobody else could do it. There were a couple of just totally killer moments in that game.
You were a pro gamer before it was cool to be too.
Technically, I was a teenage game tester. I should send you this link. Compute Magazine did an article in 1989 where they talked to us at Mindscape, and I was quoted as teenage game tester Joe Sislow. So it's one of those things that I felt like I should put up. I was a teenage game tester. So long answer, yes, I started at Mindscape, went to Jaleco, started QA there. As people left, I rose. I was head of QA. Then I wound up being assistant product manager to no one at one point. There was no product manager, but they didn't want to promote me because I was like 22. This was our first set of even remotely translated documents from Japan. Usually we didn't even get that. What ended up happening is they would drop a copy of the game on us and say, "Okay, we need new dialogue. You've got a week and a half to fill it out." We would do a playthrough on the Japanese version, try to figure out how to get through the game and get to as many screens as we can, send them text with sometimes screenshots or identifications of screens, and then they would send us another ROM back, and we would have to play through a second time to make sure that the text that we put was where we thought it would be put. And occasionally they would point out some screens and say, "You missed this, you missed this." So we had no idea whatsoever with games like the Peacekeepers, early stuff, Rushing Beat, any of those things, what was going on at all. We never had character names. There's barely any English in the games. And we had weeks to come up with filling out all the text, and then working with US writers to do the manuals. If you look up on Moby Games, there's actually a lot of the Jaleco manuals that are up there. And the credits, a lot of the weirder stuff in the credits when I'm still listed as QA was from Jeff Hill, who I worked for, who was head of he was the product manager, and Scott Lawrence, I think, was the head of QA for a while there. Scott's actually still working. I think he works for Amazon doing games now. Jeff,
Really?
I haven't seen in years. We worked together after that doing a defunct Hasbro virtual reality project that never saw the light of day. That went south really fast, and then I never really saw him again. I think I saw him one more time when I was working arcade stuff. But anyways, so I think after Jeff and Scott left, we had pared down to the point where there was like me and one other tester or something like that. And we started talking to Japan and saying, hey, you know, if we could get earlier information from you, we might be able to work better on what these games are. We tried that with Peacekeepers. We didn't get much in the way of translations, so I just made it all up. Operation Logic Bomb, I think, was after that. I'd have to look back to see if it was Peacekeepers, Operation Logic Bomb, Ignition Factor. Operation Logic Bomb, we started to get some feedback from them, which was basically, oh God, what was the name of the game? It was a knockoff of another game at the time that had that same 3/4 top-down view that basically Ignition Factor has. So we had sent, there was a friend of mine from high school named Michael Hart who got to go over to Japan. He was contemplating taking, he had his degree already, so they were contemplating making him the real product manager. He went over to Japan for a month, I want to say, and tried to work with them to say, hey, how can we do some stuff that would appeal to the US market instead of just sort of badly regionalizing the Japanese stuff. So he worked with them on a game that if I remember correctly, they were going to call it Firecat, which basically you were going to be a cat who was helping out a crew of firemen who were bumbling.
This was alluded to in the end credits of Ignition Factor.
Yeah. If we made reference to it, that's exactly why we made reference to the cat, because it was supposed to be that mechanic where they were fighting fires and screwing up, and you as the cat were going around basically saving them from themselves and actually helping them put out the fires with all of this sort of, you know, keeping them from falling into things and knocking a thing of water over that would actually put out the fire instead of them because they were using the wrong stuff and making the fire bigger. That was the original plan. Japan said, yeah, sure, we'll investigate that. And it never happened, probably for developmental reasons that I wouldn't totally know. What I do know about Jaleco as a US subsidiary is that when you screwed up in Japan, you got sent to the United States. So all of the Japanese management we had at Jaleco were effectively banned to Siberia. And it was amusing to talk to a lot of them because they would get here thinking it was going to be hell. And they were like, oh, wow, we've got wide lawns and milk and meat for our children who are now growing to be over 6 feet. And this is actually really cool. So they actually liked it. Masao Hata, who is listed on the fax that I sent you, he was the vice president of development at the time. And he actually went on to work for Atari that right before or after they got bought by Midway. I don't remember. So when I started at Midway, he was still working there and I was able to touch base with him. And he gave me a lot of my start, and he actually helped sort of broker some deals with Japan where he could. And I think that's also a lot of how we got to give some input on Ignition Factor. But because Mike had done the original design for that cat game and then left to go, I think he went to get his master's degree. I stayed around, and then the decision was made to say, hey, well, we have this engine that we did for Operation Logic Bomb. Why don't we just repurpose that as a firefighting game, and we'll see how that works. And that's how we changed into it. They still came up with the story whole cloth and then sent us the translation that you see. So we gave them feedback on like, hey, maybe try to do this. Hey, maybe try to do that. And then months went away, and then they came back with a mostly finished game and said, here, translate. So we actually got them to translate some of it as a result, which is what I sent you. And I have memory. The second stuff that I sent with the Jaleco stationery, that's the stuff that that was my document that ended up trying to piece that together. Because if you notice for most of these, they gave us numbers, but we didn't know where anything was in the game. Like, we had no concept of what screen, what stage this stuff happened at. Was this an instruction? Did it pop out while you're running around? So I had to go through and number and compare their numbers to our numbers, play through the entire game, figure out what happened. And then we sent, I think, the rest of this out to get translated, which is what I was looking for. Because one of my favorite lines that was in the translation that is in the game I couldn't see in here unless you read through it. It basically said, and I might have made reference to this somewhere, it said, put the castle in the square. That was the translation we got. Put the castle in the square. And I must have looked at that line for, I don't know, a couple of days. I could not figure out what they were talking about. I was like, what castle? Is there some, because they had the dinosaur stage. I'm like, are they doing some medieval thing? Like, what is this? Because again, we had no context. We just had the text. And so I literally translated it to put the castle in the square. I have no idea what this means. You're on your own. Yes. And I believe it's in the setup of the game because the word should have been cursor and it was mistranslated. And I figured it out later as I realized the phonetic for castle and cursor was wrong. So I think when you go to the setup at the very beginning of the game, it says, put the castle in the square. You're on your own. I have no idea what this means if the guy who's giving you instructions tries to help you. And that was the sort of stuff that even getting the translation and then even paying for a translation, we weren't able to work out all the kinks. So a lot of that was my changing some things. The naming stuff that I used to do, so back to Peacekeepers, we would use names of friends, family, people who worked at the company, anything like that. If anybody was like, hey, you want to be in it? And the other thing that ended up happening was, so I thanked Chris because at Jaleco, like we weren't Capcom, we weren't Sega, we weren't Nintendo. We didn't have any money for real advertising. Most of the game companies barely knew we were there, or most of the game magazines. So all we could do, I tried to be as friendly as heck with them and get as many of them information early on as they could. If they called up, I was always there to answer questions. We tried like heck to get cheat codes to Chris so that he could get them into Tips and Tricks, which was their side magazine at the time. But what I used to do was grab the names of the game reps that I had, and I would put them in there as sort of a nod to a thank you to try to see if we could get some more press. Because at that point in development, we're talking Christmas shovelware. When there's 100 games coming out for the SNES for Christmas, even if you get an 8, as Ignition Factor was one of the higher rated games we did while we were at Jaleco. It's basically that and Shatterhand and a whole pile of nothing, although people liked King Arthur's World and Utopia. But we couldn't get any press. So I would reserve names for things like that. And a lot of people were, on the Game Facts were beating me up over the, why'd you change the name? This was this character. Like I said, first of all, we didn't know most of the time. And then second of all, we would just use those as sort of the little bait we could to get the games press to possibly say, haha, my name's in here. I'll give this a little extra. We'll bump it up closer to the front of the mag if we're going to do a review, maybe give it a whole page instead of a column, to try to do what we could just to bump ahead in the line. Because most of the time at that point, if you advertised, if you were Sega and you had, 8 pages of advertising in every magazine, of course, your games are going to get priority. You're going to be on the cover. You're going to get really prime real estate. And, even if you screw up, they're going to be beneficial towards your games. But Jaleco, Canico, all of those smaller time, I think I would say even Tecmo, although their stuff was universally loved, didn't have the advertising money that the rest of them did. Data East, same sort of thing. So we were just trying to kind of make do.
I mean, it's crazy because the stuff that was put out by Jaleco is not, it's not like there's any bad games on there. I'm looking down the list real quickly here, like Bases Loaded, Maniac Mansion, Robo Warrior.
Games like Tough, it was the SNES, the stuff that started to get shovelware. Tough Enough, Super Goal 2, which was barely playable as a soccer game. I think we were on Bases Loaded 4 by that point, and we were getting our lunch handed to us by other baseball games at that point because it all started to be licensed at that point. You at least would have players if you didn't have teams, and we had neither. EDF was good. So King Arthur's World and Utopia were the two external developed games we had typically done, other than Jurassic, it looks like. But like, Pro Sport Hockey, we actually took our names off of that. That game was bad. And I don't think the reviews were very good at it. Yeah, they tried to do a hockey game. We got the NHLPA license, and the NHLPA would not let me rate anybody lower than a 4 or higher than a 7.
That's
so
hilarious.
Everybody was pretty much the same in that game. And we used to call it cockroach hockey because if you watch the sprites, only their feet would move and the sprite itself would just kind of float.
Oh, no.
So they would look like they had these little insecty legs. And then, of course, there was the girl who would come out and give you a stuffed animal when you scored a goal as if it was a home run. It was just weird. It was just really weird. They didn't get the sport at all. Do they have that? Yeah, Hammerlock. That was the one that we tried really hard. I tried to give them a ton of information for that. to try to make it a lot more realistic, because we were really big fans of Tecmo World Wrestling and stuff like that at the time, and it was like, let's see if we can get it. And it wasn't too bad, but we couldn't get the level of moves in there that we wanted. I had sent them reams. We tried to have it basically as complex as some of those, so that each character would have, you know, crazy amounts of moves. And I think they wound up restricting it a lot, and it just didn't play as well as we would have hoped. It wasn't that bad though. I think the reviews were okay on it.
Yeah, it's a good looking game too. Like for the time, I mean, that was a very good looking game.
But yeah, that was the sort of thing where we really loved the Tecmo World Wrestling, which took off of pro wrestling, where you would have those moves that would give you a cutscene when you got a certain amount of, you know, imbalance in the match to kind of create the drama. So we had that half section where you could try to, you know, illustrate a lot more. I think it was an expensive cart, and they probably weren't really happy with how it sold. But yeah, because it you know, those sprites were huge, and I'm sure that memory was tough for them to do. But they were experimenting, because I think both King Arthur's World and Utopia would work with the SNES mouse. And I think King Arthur's World was one of the first 3D stereo games. Wasn't there something with that? Like they had a different audio chip in that box. That's because that was
Oh, really?
yeah, that was Jez from Argonaut. Yeah, exactly. And that was one of the few. There weren't a lot of those. It was like they gave you an option to do mode 7, which was what F-Zero was, but they had a separate audio chip, and they were really trying to push peripherals at the time. So we were trying to do whatever possible to get Nintendo to like us. Because it was hard. I mean, people forget how hard Nintendo, I don't know how they are now. I really haven't, you know, been in publishing since that point, but the Bible we had to adhere to, that you had to change stuff, which was the whole no liquor, no religion, like, and they would get you for the smallest things. And if you missed them, you got bumped from the line. And with cartridge manufacturing time and how many companies were trying to get released for Christmas, if you didn't make it through QA by the end of August, you were dead. You weren't going to make Christmas. And if you didn't make Christmas, that just blew your whole lineup for the year. So your whole life was spent making sure that every single possible thing that Nintendo could bounce you for was taken care of. And that was your exclusive job if you worked on Nintendo games, especially. And it was a pain. I'll tell you, that was a real pain, because they had you had to give them a videotape of a complete playthrough of everything they felt you could do with the game. And I remember at one point we were trying to do ads for which baseball? Maybe it was Super Bases Loaded, but it might have been Bases Loaded 4 for the NES. They wanted us to do stuff like, we need a triple play on tape. We need to know what happens when you have this sort. And it was just so hard to try to set some of those things up to actually get those and then splice those sections of tape together, because you wouldn't be able to do all that stuff in a single game, in a single playthrough. So things like that were just a royal pain.
Yeah, Nintendo has lightened up on that, probably really only in the past couple of years as to content level.
Yeah.
But from my understanding, publishing on consoles is still brutal in general.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, granted, you have the ability to do patches now, which you didn't before. Like, it was death to release a game with a serious bug, because if it got into a cart and it got onto shelves, you were dead. You were dead. Like, they were going to return them, and you had to pay a ton. And Nintendo took their tithing on every cartridge produced, period, end of story. You had to manufacture through them with the cartridge era. So that would sink companies if you let bugs out. It just wasn't allowed. So, you know, people talk about video game crunch, and that's where that really came from, is just, you're just sitting there hooked up to a tape machine 24/7. Because if something happens, you have to be able to play it back for the developer. You have to be able to describe what you were doing if it's not evident on the tape. They have to be able to find it, fix it, and then you got to burn ROMs, get them back to the QA team, and then do complete regression on all the rest of the stuff to make sure that nothing else happened. Somebody didn't burn the wrong ROM, et cetera, for a full playthrough. That's how I got really good at playing a lot of those NES games, because what would happen is you get 3/4 of the way through the game, you'd find the bug, you'd send it to them, they'd send it back, you'd have to get 3/4 of the way through the game again, you'd find another bug, they'd fix it, they'd send it back, you have to play the same amount through the game. You'd finish these games, you'd get to the point where you could, like I said, I wasn't joking. When I was working at Mindscape, we were testing Gauntlet 2. I tested it for IBM, Amiga, Commodore 64, Atari ST, Game Boy, NES. Like, I could see that game in my sleep. I probably paid something like 5,000 levels of Gauntlet. You just, you just drop after a certain point because you've seen it so much, you know everything that can happen, and yet you still have to just keep playing it and be able to demonstrate what they want you to demonstrate, get through it in a quick manner so that you can do it, generate a tape of any bugs or problems, be able to immediately stop what you're doing, write down everything that happened and convey that in a manner. That's why even to this day, I have the utmost respect for anybody doing QA, because the amount of work and the amount of attention to detail that's required for a good QA person, they're worth their weight in gold. And development kits were too expensive. Like, we never even had one at Jaleco. That was all wherever the developers were. So even at Mindscape, they were in a separate place with a room, and they would be working on their tools. And all that happened is they would come in, hand you a disk and say, it's time to go. Or Japan would send us ROMs and say, burn these, go. Like that was it. So we didn't even have access to real, development stuff. It was literally just that we could burn ROMs and pop them into a cart, and that the carts we had, I think the carts we had were special as far as doing ROMs. Like, I don't think anybody could burn a cart. Yeah. But outside of that, like the systems we had were just systems. Like, there was nothing special. We didn't have development systems or anything. That wasn't until when I was at when I was at Midway, and they started to have like Dreamcast developer systems that QA would use and things like that. But those things were always 10 times as expensive as a regular system because of all the debugging stuff that was on it. So, the system sells retail for $200 to $400. QA is not going to have too many of those. They'll have as few as they can. They're sure as heck not going to have $800 to $1,000 machines there that, some of us chuckleheads in QA would have broken. So
I think a lot of times they're leased out now too. Like, it's not like they're,
oh yeah,
you got to send that back.
I can see that, especially early on. Yeah. It's like a brand new system. Like that picture of that PS5, I don't know if that's a developer system or if that's just their rendering with that crazy, almost Jaguar looking throne thing or whatever it is. Yeah. I was actually scanning a bunch of the Hasbro stuff that I found with this and looking at some of the costs, because we used to do development for that on SGIs. So your development kit for a developer at that point was between $20,000 and $40,000 to allow them to develop on those things. Those either were leased or were owned by the first party, which Hasbro, and then they would send those to developers to allow them, and they only had 6 of them. So it was like, okay, well, you guys have to figure out how to use these, because we're not going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars letting you guys mess around. Yeah, so I did that, and then came back and was a designer for FASA for about 5 months before they got absorbed by Microsoft, I want to say, and then worked for Midway. Ended up working for 3Com, getting out of games, ended up coming back. And then I worked arcade for 12 years. Yeah. I worked on all the game system, all the retro arcade systems that were officially licensed by Namco and by Midway. So the multi Miss Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, Galaga, Centipede Centipede Millipede, Missile Command, Let's Go Bowling, Robotron Joust. And then we did a bowling game called Let's Go Bowling. Then I went to work for Raw Thrills, which is Eugene Jarvis's company. And I still think that arcade games were early free to play, because the deal was you were spending your time and it took money, and you would spend money to get more time. But the better you got, the deal was the more time you would get on the game, which is why the guy that I worked for at Cosmodog, when we were doing the games, he could roll a Robotron. I'd never seen anybody play like that. He could talk to you, talk about code, be on the phone, and be adding lives to a level 5 Robotron game, just watching it tick up until he basically rolled the game over. And I think that's what happened, is that in those days they said, okay, well, we're going to make it brain dead hard. And it doesn't matter, because 99% of our audience are going to pay for that 1%. But that 1% would get on a game and they would park on it, and the game earnings would drop off to near zero, because if one guy could get on, pop in a quarter, and play for 8 hours, well, you just got a quarter's worth of income for 8 hours worth of play on your game. So, but before that point, I felt there was always that the better you get, the longer you can stay on the game. And games were always, there was no end to Spy Hunter. There was no end to Joust or Defender or any of those games. You just played them until you died. They were pure existentialism that way.
Back in the day, Area 51 in the arcades was a shooter on rails. And I think I used to be able to beat that in like 50 cents or something. And it was a spectacle.
Yeah, you'd get a crowd and people would know, and that's the same sort of thing, because I think that was near the end when they started doing, because that was, I want to say Area 51, actually Midway had just put that out, because it was basically, let me think, because that was Atari though, but Atari Arcade was owned by Midway, And I want to say I saw that because we had a lunchroom where they would test different games, and that's where like Ed Boon tested the Grid. And then the new Mortal Kombats would go in there. I was working there when they started their sports division. So I worked on Showtime Gold, which was an expansion for NBA Showtime. And then they started coming out with the home versions they had just come out with the SNES port of Blitz, and they were trying to come out with some other stuff. But yeah, I want to say Area 51 was kind of like a throwback to the Terminator 2 and the Aerosmith game, which were both those sort of
Revolution X.
It just makes you love the fact that we finally have an independent gaming scene. And I know a lot of people don't last doing that, but I can still play indie games now and again and realize you can feel the love for those creators, unlike something that you're just realizing somebody's manipulating you and it's just one big Skinner box to try to keep putting quarters in or keep playing the game or keep coming back for the next day. And it's gotten, that end of it on free to play is really, really scares me, because that actually kind of takes advantage of people's manias almost to a point where they've engineered it to a point. You could see that when Zynga was doing their early stuff and how the Facebook gaming was going, everything was kind of going that direction. So I'm so happy to see exactly how big independent gaming was, because I dreamed of that back in the day. We didn't have it. I actually wrote an article for a publication called Game Week, kind of talking about what was going to be the Sundance of video games someday when you had independent creators. This is before Steam and any of those, and it was just a nice idea to see that. So it's another reason why I'm blathering probably too much, but I'm happy that you and other players are reaching out about even some of my, Ignition Factor is nothing compared to other games that formed my childhood or anything like that. I'm happy that some people got some play out of them, but the fact that people are still interested enough to want to take your own weeknights to talk to somebody about a game like that is just it makes those wasted years, because I worked in video games for almost 25 years, and I'll tell you, there were a lot of moments where I asked myself why the heck I was doing it, because you're just like, when you're just shoveling something in there that gets a 6 in EGM, and you're just like, why does anybody care? Like, who cares that I'm working on Hammerlock Wrestling? Who cares that I did one level for Mech Commander Gold, or I helped do a roster update for NBA Showtime for Midway. Is anybody even looking at this stuff anymore? It's not like everybody who's like, yeah, I worked on Grand Theft Auto. It's not quite the same thing.
There's a lot of heart, though. I mean, as cheesy as that sounds, I mean, like, this is, Ignition Factor. It's just I rented that game, like 4 or 5 times probably. Yeah. Because I was just determined, and I always got stuck on one level. So going back to it now and kind of going, finally like beating it, and then actually seeing how absurd everything gets was just fantastic.
Yeah, and that was like, I tried to do that because, again, back to the testing thing, I would have to do playthroughs of the game. At that point, I wasn't testing as much. I might do some playthroughs and see what was going on, but I had come through that and known what it was like to play through this entire game multiple times and say, okay, what can I do? I couldn't change the code. Like, I wasn't developing the game. I couldn't go back to Japan and say, hey, do this. This makes this better. Do that. But I could put stuff in there that if you read it or if you saw it, it would maybe make you crack a smile. And granted, hindsight's 2020. When you're 22 years old, some stuff you find is funny is pretty stupidly corny. But at least when you're trying to entertain yourself and put stuff in there so that people would say, hey, somebody actually cared enough to try to craft some of these things. And that's what I try to do, at least with the game facts on Peacekeepers, because there's a lot of stuff I put into Peacekeepers. For example, one of the moments I was prouder of was there was a point in the game where, and I actually liked a lot about that game because it was basically your standard side-scrolling beat 'em up, except it branched. So depending upon what you did, you could go to different levels. There was areas, there were secret exits out. It was almost like, Outrun meets the side-scrolling beat 'em up, that you didn't wind up in the same place with the same endings. And there was a level where you had a character that could come along and help you, that you could ask to help. And I don't remember if it was a robot or what happened, but at the end of the level, it would just betray you. Like, it would turn on you. And it came out of the complete blue. Like, there was nothing that I could see in the game that would tell you that. So the only nod I could think to put in was I named the level, I believe it was the Queen of Cups Bridge. And if you knew anything about tarot, or you had seen the movie Live and Let Die with James Bond, the Queen of Cups was the card of deceit. So the idea is that it was a little nod to tell you that it was a lie, that there was a lie on that level to maybe let you give a little bit of an idea that you weren't just going to get screwed over by the game. Because amongst the obtuse amounts of references that I would just put in because I was bored and I had to come up with names or figures or names of buildings or things that would happen. So, like, for example, in Peacekeepers, a good friend of mine at the time, her name was Sheila McGlone. So I named the McGlone mine after her. I think I told her about it afterwards. She might not have even known. And then Chris was Chris Bieniak. And actually, the review I sent you, the reason I sent you that is, who's the girl? What's her name? Betty. Betty was the other reviewer on Ignition Factor. If you looked it up, she was one of the reviewers at the time. So Chris and Betty wound up reviewing the game, and I had named it after them in the game, and we had done it a bunch of times. And I think, who's the guy? He used to write strategy guides for them, and he lived. Talk about a dream life. He lived on the beach in Hawaii and wrote video game strategy guides.
Oh, that sounds real rough.
Zach Meston. So I think either the Weston mine, I changed it slightly, but he was the rich man who owned the other mine or something like that. Not the mine. He was the rich guy for one of the. He might have owned the dinosaur park, but I named it after him.
Yeah, there was one. There was like a skyscraper that's they say something about the owner in that.
Yeah, exactly. And that was another one where I was just like, all right, well, let me see what I can put in some of these. But a lot of it, like the plot, we didn't really get much of a chance to change. The rest of the dialogue, you could probably, if you went through to compare, you'd see that all I was doing was, making it a little less stilted at times. So, maybe we'd save a few characters and putting in a contraction that they wouldn't know, or say, get them instead of get them, or something like that. Very, what was his name on The Simpsons? Rainier Wolfcastle, up and at them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you had really strict character limits too, I imagine.
Oh yeah. So if you look at the Jaleco ones, the reason those are line wrapped the way they are is because where the dialogue was like that, that's as many characters as we had.
Right.
So yeah. And the screens were small, and you didn't, I think those were those even 320 by 240? They might've been at the time. That was considered, what was that at the time? Standard res and arcade. I don't remember what it was for the SNES. But yeah, we didn't have a lot to work with. So if you wanted to get punctuation in there, you had to be very, you had to do it with a point. And a lot of it, we'd go back and forth and screw up occasionally on the typo, and they'd put it in, and we'd see that there wasn't a comma or something was missed, or a character got lopped off at the end because I sent them one too many characters and you couldn't see it in the screen. So that was the sort of testing, and Nintendo would bounce you for that. Like one visual typo and you're out. Like you get back in line. And that stuff they would see. They were on like hawks. Like most of their QA report stuff to you was bad. I think the only one I ever heard they missed was the hamster in the microwave, actually, on Maniac Mansion. And there was an argument about that because you could do it in the computer game. But I think they missed it because nobody thought you could do it. But it actually wound up in the NES version.
Oh no! Well, they must not.
Yeah, because you weren't supposed to be able to kill anything like that. Oh, I don't think they were. No, I don't think they were happy at all once they found out, because they were not happy with you if you didn't, like, they would just stall you in line or take longer to look at your game, or not give you as many cartridges because they'd say, well, we thought maybe we could manufacture this many, but we're only giving you this many for it. And then if you had your minimums, that's how much it would take to break even at that amount, and they didn't manufacture as many, well, you didn't make as much money that year. So yeah, they were none too happy about it. I am disturbed. I will still see if I can find the other translations, because I really want to find that castle line again while I'm talking.
What's awesome about that line, by the way, is that line pops up every single time you go back to the map screen. So if you go, when you're in the mission briefing and you go to something and then come back to the map, that line pops up in every single level, and it's wild.
Yeah. And I think what happened was I tried like hell to figure out where that was, and I couldn't. And then once the cart came, it was too late to make the change for that one when I finally saw it, because it was, I think now that you mention it, if you know what you're doing on that screen and you don't go to the map, you don't see it.
Yeah, you never see it.
Yeah, you can play through the setup and not see it. So I think what happened is I went through it and then I saw it, and then I also laughed and said, well, that's awesome. I have to leave that because that's just such a goofy fingerprint. Nobody's going to understand why he's saying that to you, but whatever. It's one of those things. And the other fingerprints, by the way, that I used to put, you'll know that I worked on a Jaleco game if some character or some monster or something is Fnord, Fnord. Yeah, so all of the Jaleco games, and I actually tried to carry that forward. I used to try to sneak that into every single game that I worked on anywhere. And it really disturbs me because the last bowling game I worked on, I had it really, really well hidden. I had redone one of the screens such that we had pencils next to the scorecards and it said Fnord Office Products. And I thought I got it in there, and my boss got really mad at me for some reason that I put it on the pencil, and he made me take it out. And I was upset because we had different scorecards for 1, 2, 3, or 4 players. And I could have put it in just 3 or 4 and he never would have noticed it and I would have got it in there. And I think that's the only game I've worked on where I haven't gotten it in there so that it's there at some point. So like, if I remember correctly, so if you ever find Centipede, Millipede, Missile Command, Let's Go Bowling in the arcades, that one didn't sell nearly as well as the Ms. Pac Galaga, which you see everywhere because we sold like 25,000 of those. That funded the whole company. I was aghast at how many more people wanted copies of Ms. Pac-Man in their bar at that point. But Let's Go Bowling was not an actual bowling game. We made that. I ended up, myself and the guy who worked for the company, Andrew Pines, we ended up writing that in 6502 assembly because we had simulated the old Atari chip. So we had to come up, one of the sales guys promised we'd put a bowling game in it. So we did that. And what I did was that if your score ends on certain numbers at the end of a frame, it'll give you a message on screen. And that was, if you wound up with 42 at the end of a frame, it would say Fnord, I believe it was, nice. Unless it was 88. It's one of those two. I used to like to use 88 a lot, but that was in there. So like there's an enemy named Fnord in Peacekeepers. There's other characters named Fnord in, Tough Enough or Operation Logic Bomb or any of those. I got it into manuals. I was listed as Joe Fnord Sislow in a couple places. So that was you'll know that I had something to do with the game if you see that in there for any of the Jaleco games. But yeah, Young Indiana Jones Chronicles is still one of those that I have a soft spot for because I got that. I still remember it was one of those moments where you feel like you're actually doing something okay, where they call you up and, you basically come into the office, turn around, throw a 3-pointer over your head. It goes in, you give them a high five and you walk out and you go, wow, I can't believe that actually worked. That never happens. And that was, I literally did that whole tape in one take. And I've done it. I mean, I played the game a lot. It's just when somebody calls you up last minute and there's like 4 people sitting there wringing their hands, watching you play. Yeah, you're just thinking that, like, am I going to be able to do that? So let me see what year that would have been. That was after Maniac Mansion, so it would have been 89. No, because the other one, everybody calling up, hey, can you help me play the SDNEX? Nobody could say that word. It's a Steinax. I mean, I'd be honored if any of those games actually made it on their store.
Yes,
it just gives it so much of a larger market.
Ignition Factor actually has a Wii U version on the Virtual Console. Yep.
All right, I stopped at my Wii and I didn't get a Switch and I never had a Wii U. So yeah, I kind of stopped playing games by that point too much. But that's cool. So I wonder how many of those the other Jaleco games they did, because I had wondered if they even had ROMs of most of them. That's the problem. I don't even know what happened. I mean, Jaleco got bought by some company out of Europe, and I never found out what, because I just thought, did you see that picture that I retweeted that some guy retweeted of their old factory in Japan?
Yes.
With all the letters peeling off of it? Yeah. So, I mean, I know they were never, one of my other favorite stories, by the way, was at one point, one of the Japanese guys came in and told us, he walked in with like a set of aquarium equipment. He had like a bubbler and some tubes and like I don't remember if he had a toy or not, like one of those chests that would open, but I remember he had like the bubbler and all that sort of stuff and some rocks. And he was like, we're going to start selling our, aquarium equipment. And I was like, what? Like, wait, what? So I know they were always flirting with like what the heck they were actually doing. And a lot of those Japanese companies did it. I mean, if you think about it, Nintendo started out making playing cards before they somehow, they moved into making video games. So it doesn't surprise me that they would do that. But at the same time, like we were never a successful company. Like those most of the numbers they did on those, they would be lucky to manufacture 50,000 of some of those cards. The only one that I can remember that sold over 100,000 copies was Maniac Mansion for the NES, and maybe Bases Loaded. But the later ones and even the SNES games, they just didn't sell. They didn't do numbers. They would manufacture between 25 and 50,000 if they thought. Most of the time they would go less than that. So I know there weren't a lot of people playing, Hammerlock Wrestling. That's why they probably wound up in rentals, and a lot of kids did get a chance to try them. But they were never hits. Like, they were never anything where you'd sit there and be like, oh, I'm going to go on the floor of CES and they're going to be talking about all these great games that Jaleco's doing. So, if you had a lot of games, you could probably get them for cheap. And that's another thing that happened, because I bet you the rental companies sold these as they got worse. So everybody could go get their used copy from Blockbuster or wherever. But yeah, there weren't that many copies. I mean, I'm happy that I have box copies, shrink wrapped, of almost all the ones I worked on the SNES. One of my favorite Game Boy games, by the way, and one of the best games I think they ever did, and they did an arcade version of it, is frigging Avenging Spirit. Did you ever play Avenging Spirit?
Oh, yeah. It's a fantastic game.
Yeah, it was. It was an amazing, and I mean, it was a superior Game Boy game, and they had an arcade version of it. I think it started as an arcade game in Japan, but it was one of the earliest games that I knew where you could switch sprites. Like, you were playing different characters as you would jump between sprites in the game. So you could inhabit any enemy in the game and you could play as them. And it was just amazing, because there'd be characters that could jump, characters that had different weapons, characters that had different health. It was just something that I had never seen at the time. And I have a shrink wrap copy of that, because they were testing that just as I was there. But Avenging Spirit was fantastic. I think that game should get way, way more. If there's one Jaleco game that I think people haven't played that they should play, it's that. And it's probably that it's holding it back because it's Game Boy, says it's 2-color. I wonder if there's an arcade ROM out there. There's probably got to be. And then for the NES, to be fair, I mean, Wampum was just a reskinned Mega Man, except it's Native American themed. Yeah. And Shatterhand wasn't bad. It was kind of fun. It wasn't amazing, but it was
cool.
Yeah. And I think Steinax was basically their sort of Rygar ripoff without being as cool. They were really good at doing ports of other people's games. They were definitely one of those companies that would have, said, hey, they're doing Pac-Man, we're going to do Mousetrap, except not as good. They didn't innovate a lot, which is why I was surprised with Avenging Spirit. It was probably that was just a port of an arcade game, and they had a couple of good arcade developers at the time, I guess. Although Jaleco was never really known for their arcade gaming either.
The Game Boy version did come out on 3DS Virtual Console, looks like.
Just to give you a little bit of advice from what I knew back in the day, and I'm still not sure what it's like at this point, but there's always need for good QA, because I don't care how development changes. And right now I work with a lot of stuff that does a lot of unit tests, yada, yada, yada. You're not going to get that complexity from automated testing. We used to try to have, like, I would have a self-drive mode that could play the game in my driving games, but it wouldn't still be able to find the edge cases that a good QA person would do. And then if you add that with an attention to detail and the ability to communicate afterwards what happened, you get one of those roles, you can soar up into design, you can soar up into development, basically product management, coming out of those areas, because you learn so much about gaming. Obviously, I think the better thing, if you want to do your own development, is continue to work on your own projects, whatever they are. Because I know a bunch of the companies I said, they don't even care if you have a degree. They don't even care if you have experience. If you come in with something that you've worked on and you can talk about it intelligently, that's really the way to go about it too. So if those are helpful for you, yeah, exactly. It doesn't even matter if you've necessarily shipped it. If you've gotten some user feedback, that's always helpful. But I think it's more that you did some stuff and that you could talk about it intelligently, because they know everybody doesn't have the means to necessarily get a game on Steam or get a game on, I don't know, is Newgrounds around anymore? Whatever easier methods there are to get games out these days. That's still a lot more work to bring a product, because you get to the point where the game starts to come together and you're starting to have those edge case bugs. Okay, you still have another 80% of your time left to finish a lot of that, to get it to full polish. And that's where the work is. So I don't think anybody expects that. So if you're doing that, stick with it. Although personally, if you've got a group of friends and you guys are doing your own stuff, keep it small. My advice to you is, do not ever let feature creep kill you, because it will. You guys will just keep adding cool stuff. I would put those in a box and save them for your next game. get it done and get it out there, and then try to figure out how you can monetize what you might need to so that you could actually live off of it. Obviously that means balancing it in such a way that you respect your audience, not just, free to play, whatever sort of take advantage of people nonsense. But hey, if that's your bag and that's what you like, I'm not going to cast aspersions on anybody who's trying to do what they love as long to do that. But just my little bit of advice from working in games. And if not, you know what, find something else to do and do it as a hobby, because I personally think that there's only so many people who are going to be able, it's kind of probably like movies. There's a lot of people who love movies, and there are only a number of people who are lucky enough to be able to make a full living doing it. And if you can make games that people love and you can still survive doing whatever else you're doing on however you got your game going, there's no harm, no foul on that. Don't get caught up in any sort of anybody judging your game based upon its technical merits or its size or its length or anything like that. Because at least right now I've seen it's so much cooler to see independent developers saying, hey, I've got this idea. I'm going to put it out. I don't care if it's 40 hours. I don't care if it's 20 hours. I don't care if it's 5 hours. If people enjoy it, that's what matters. And I think that's really the cooler part of it. So I hope you get an opportunity to do some of these things. And honestly, way more than I did than you're just writing text for somebody else's game. Yeah, be all I can say is when you make your deal with the devil, be very specific about what you want to do. Don't just say, I want to work in video games. Okay, here you go. You get to put the manuals in the box. Good luck. Somebody's got to do it.
The good news on feature creep is I'm kind of the dream crusher when it comes to that, and I'm really good at keeping things down in scope. So
good. Because one we used to joke at a lot of the game companies I was at that the phrase you needed to ban was, wouldn't it be cool if? Because you start saying that, and yes, it would be cool, but you just doubled our timeline here, and we're not going to get a game out. We're going to spend another year dicking around with something that might wind up being a dead end too, because if there's no actual publisher waiting for you telling you have to make this Christmas, you can fool around with it as long as you want. I mean, I'm sure for every game your Jonathan Blow or whoever ended up putting out, they aborted 5 or 6 after spending way too much time doing something or some ideas like that. And you hear that a lot, where the developers will pursue something that just won't work. And I've definitely been associated with a number of games and systems that have been killed, not even just because of reasons that they didn't work, but would anybody want to invest that much money in them at that point? Would something else happen? And there's interesting stories to tell all along. So I hope you get a bunch of those at least.
Thank you so much for this.
Yeah, no problem. I hope you get something practical out of it, and I don't come across as too much of an idiot as most people are listening to it, but I guess we'll have to see how many of the Rushing Beat fans will be pissed at me for being a little irreverent with their world. But I hope they all understand that working in it, I had nothing but the utmost respect for those players, and I have the utmost respect that, it's almost 30 years later here now, we're talking about these games still. So it means something to me that my early 20s wasn't completely wasted sitting in a room, answering collect calls from prisons of people playing our Jaleco game. So, thank you. Thanks for, getting in touch with me and giving me the opportunity to kind of go off about this. I appreciate it.
Yeah, again, thank you so much. And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed all of that information and discussions of olden times and how things relate to nowadays and whatnot. And again, I know I said it in the recording, but thank you very much again to Joe for entertaining the idea of this interview and giving us some more insight and giving us some of those documents to look at and see really, kind of what went into games back then and what specifically went into this game. So I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed this different take on content here. If you did, click like, helps a bunch. Leave a comment or any feedback. Subscribe for more. I'll see you soon.